I am Gerald Crane, though everyone in the high-stakes commercial real estate world knows me simply as Jerry. 70 years old, recently left, holding the deed to a crumbling, neglected farm my late wife left behind, while my son claimed our $12 million penthouse in Houston. That boy, my own blood, looked me in the eye, called me a worthless old man, and put me out on the street like I was nothing. So, I pointed the car toward that old property and figured I'd sleep there for the night. Then I shoved open the heavy wooden door, and every muscle in my body locked up at what was waiting inside. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If stories like this one speak to you, consider staying close and following along so you never miss one. Before we go further, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had someone you deeply trusted turn out to be working against you? Just yes or no is enough. A quick note. Some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental. It's the truth inside the story that matters most. Let me take you back to the exact moment my entire reality shattered. It was a gloomy Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I buried my beautiful wife, Lorraine. We had been married for 40 incredible years, 4 decades of shared dreams, building a massive real estate portfolio from scratch, and creating what I genuinely believed was a rock-solid, loving family. I had stepped down as chairman of my firm a few years prior, willingly surrendering my hard-earned career so I could be at Lorraine's side through her final grueling battle with illness. I loved her more than life itself, and I would have traded every dollar and every deal just to have one more healthy day with her. I was sitting in the freezing glass-walled office of our longtime estate attorney, Alton Breck. The room felt sterile and lifeless, drained of the warmth that Lorraine had always carried into every space she entered. Across the heavy walnut conference table sat my son Dylan and his wife Petra. Dylan wore a tailored charcoal suit, and Petra clutched a designer crocodile skin clutch. They were checking their expensive watches, looking far more like they were gearing up for an exclusive red carpet appearance than grieving a woman they had just lost. I sat there in my simple charcoal suit, weighed down by the heavy exhaustion of grief. I expected the reading of the will to be a straightforward formality. Lorraine and I had always talked through our estate planning together over morning coffee. I assumed the core assets would stay under my management until my own time came, and then pass naturally to Dylan. Alton cleared his throat, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked down at the thick stack of legally binding documents. His voice was flat and toneless, completely detached from the emotional detonation he was about to set off in that room. He began with the clause covering our primary residence, the $12 million luxury penthouse in downtown Houston. I knew that property inside and out. I had paid cash for it 10 years ago, designing every single inch alongside Lorraine, so it would be our perfect forever home with sweeping views across the city skyline. Alton read clearly without a moment's hesitation that full ownership and title of the Houston penthouse was to be transferred immediately to Dylan and Petra. I blinked hard, genuinely convinced my 70-year-old ears were playing a cruel trick on me. I waited for Alton to catch himself to mention my life estate, or at least my right to remain in the home I had purchased. He didn't. He just kept reading, moving straight past it as though 40 years of marriage and every dollar I had contributed meant nothing at all. Then he reached the section of the will that pertained to my inheritance. According to the document, the man who had loved, protected, and provided for Lorraine every day of her adult life was left with nothing but a neglected, rotting farm out in East Texas. A desolate, overgrown stretch of land sitting a full 2 hours outside the city, a barren plot we had picked up years ago and never thought about again. I leaned forward slowly, my hands clamped around the armrests of my chair, so tightly my knuckles drained white. I looked at Alton, my voice shaking with a tangled surge of grief and pure disbelief. I asked him calmly to pause, wondering aloud whether some clerical error had crept in, some drafting mistake that had accidentally transposed the names. Before Alton could even draw breath to respond, Dylan shot across the table and snatched the document straight out of the attorney's hands. A sharp, arrogant laugh burst out of him, bouncing off the cold glass walls. In that single chilling moment, the mask of the grieving devoted son fell away completely. He fixed his eyes on me, and what filled them was pure, unguarded contempt. I will never forget that stare. It turned my blood to ice. "You heard the man, Dad," Dylan said, his voice thick with venomous condescension. "The penthouse is ours now. There's no mistake. Mom finally saw things clearly before she died. She knew you were losing your edge, losing your mind. And frankly, a useless old man like you has no business living in a $12 million property. The room began to spin. The boy I had taught to ride a bike. The son I had proudly put through the finest business schools in America. The child I had stayed up through the night to comfort when he was sick. He was looking at me like I was garbage taking up his space. I tried to speak to demand some kind of explanation, but the shock choked every word. Dylan leaned in closer, jabbing the heavy legal papers against the polished wood table. You need to go home. Pack your things and be out of my property by 5 hours this evening. He said, his eyes narrowing to slits. Petra and I are hosting a private dinner for some very important VIP clients tonight. We are closing a massive deal, and we do not have the time or the patience to deal with a senile old fool wandering through the living room and ruining our image. I was completely numb. My chest ached with a pain far worse than anything physical I had ever endured. I don't even remember the drive back to the penthouse. What I remember is the humiliating blur of packing 40 years of my life into 2 small travel suitcases. I did it while Dylan's hired private security stood just outside the bedroom door, tracking my every movement as if I were a stranger looting a hotel room. By 4:30 in the afternoon, I was standing in the grand marble hallway near the front elevators, being pushed out of the very home I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The heavy brass elevator doors chimed, ready to carry me down to the lobby and out of their lives for good. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase, feeling utterly defeated. Then Petra stepped out from the shadows of the corridor, wearing a sickening, triumphant smirk that turned my stomach. She reached into the pocket of her expensive designer blazer and pressed a small, unmarked prescription bottle roughly into my hand. "Lorraine's dying wish," Petra whispered, leaning uncomfortably close to my ear just beyond earshot of the security guards. "Take 2 a day for your hard old man, have a safe drive to nowhere." The heavy brass doors slid shut and sealed me out of the life I had spent decades building. I stood there on the cold marble, the smooth plastic of that unlabeled bottle pressing into my palm, Petra's cruel whisper still ringing in my ears as I gripped my suitcase and made my way down to the underground parking garage. The descent felt like a funeral march. I found my beat-up Chevy pickup truck wedged between 2 gleaming European sports cars, a relic from my early construction days kept alive out of pure nostalgia and a stubborn refusal to forget my roots. I threw my bags onto the passenger seat and settled behind the wheel. The vinyl was cracked, smelling faintly of motor oil and sawdust. I sat there under the dim fluorescent lights, staring at the small white pills inside the clear plastic container. No label, no dosage instructions, no pharmacy stamp, just smooth white tablets. My mind was spinning, trying to absorb the whiplash of the last 2 hours. Lorraine and I had built an empire side by side. Every financial decision, every triumph, every burden shared. How could she have secretly drawn up a will that left me with nothing while handing our crown jewel to a son who looked at me with that kind of venom? It made no sense. Lorraine was a meticulous woman, a former forensic accountant who dissected every contract and every bank statement we ever signed. Abandoning me with a decaying farm in East Texas and a bottle of mystery pills was flatly at odds with the woman I had loved for 40 years. I needed answers. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen. My thumb hovered over Dylan's name. I took a slow breath, trying to quiet the tremor in my hand, and hit dial. The line rang 3 times before it clicked open. I braced for him to snap at me for interrupting his important evening. Instead, I heard the faint chime of crystal glasses in the background and the low murmur of unfamiliar voices. Then Dylan spoke, and the raw hostility from the attorney's office had vanished completely. What replaced it was an overly warm, almost syrupy sweetness that sent a chill straight through me. "Dad," he said, his voice projecting brightly through the speakerphone. "So glad you called back. Petra and I were just talking about you. You doing all right, Pop? You need us to arrange a car service to get you out to the country." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, jaw clenched. He was performing, playing the role of the devoted, worried son for the benefit of his wealthy guests. "Dylan," I said, keeping my voice quiet and even. "What is happening here? Why did your mother leave the penthouse to you? We built that home together. And what exactly are these pills Petra forced into my hand?" Dylan let out a soft, measured sigh, perfectly crafted to sound like a man burdened by an aging parent. "Oh, Dad!" he murmured with practiced sympathy. "We went over this at the lawyer's office. Mom did this to protect you. She could see you were having trouble keeping up with things." I sat back completely thrown by how calm he sounded. Protect me by tossing me into the street. Protect me by shipping me off to a rotting farmhouse 2 hours from my doctors and my whole life? "Yes, Dad." Dylan answered smoothly, his tone almost unbearably patient. "Think it through for a moment. The property taxes and HOA fees on that penthouse run close to $200,000 a year. You are 70 years old living on a fixed retirement income. If Mom had left that property in your name, the city and the banks would have eaten through your savings inside of a year. You would have gone bankrupt trying to carry a $12 million asset on your own." I sat still in the driver's seat, listening to the low hum of the garage ventilation. His argument landed like ice water on my face. From a purely financial standpoint, it carried a brutal kind of logic. Lorraine had always been ruthlessly clear-eyed about taxes and protecting assets. Could she have made a cold, calculated call to shield my cash reserves by unloading the penthouse's crushing overhead onto Dylan? "You'll have peace out in East Texas." Dylan continued softly, leaning into the quiet. "She wanted you to spend your golden years away from the smog and the noise of the city, resting on a quiet piece of land. And those pills, Dad, please don't dig in your heels about them. Your memory has been slipping. You've been blanking on names, losing your keys, getting turned around in conversations. Mom was frightened about your cognitive decline. She spent a fortune having those high-end Swiss cognitive supplements specially ordered for you before she passed. She made Petra promise to see that you took them, 2 a day just like she wanted. Take them, Dad. Do it for Mom." I shut my eyes. Was I actually losing my grip? Had grief warped my judgment, twisted my own son into a monster, simply because I was wounded by what might have been a hard-nosed financial decision? I didn't have the strength to fight him anymore. I told him I'd phone when I reached East Texas and ended the call. I sat in the dim glow of the truck cabin for a long while. The logic of what he'd said settled slowly into my exhausted mind. It was a brutal truth maybe, but perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was just a worn-out old man who needed to accept the hand he'd been dealt. I snapped the cap off the plastic bottle, tapped a single smooth white tablet into my palm, and washed it down with a swig of lukewarm water from the bottle in my cup holder. I fired up the engine, dropped the truck into gear, and rolled out of the underground garage, leaving everything I had ever known behind me. The late afternoon sun was already pushing toward the horizon as I merged onto Highway 290. The steady rhythm of the road usually brought me some peace, but today it all felt distant, muffled, unreachable. 40 minutes into the drive, the world beyond my windshield started to bend. My vision smeared violently, turning the deep orange sunset into a wild, distorted blur. A sudden cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and my hands began shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I gasped. My heart rate was cratering my chest, filling up with what felt like wet concrete. I hammered the brakes tires, shrieking, and wrenched the truck onto the gravel shoulder just before everything went black. I came back with a violent heaving gasp, lungs burning, as though I'd been held underwater for hours. My hands were still locked around the wheel knuckles, aching. The truck cabin was pitch dark apart from the faint glow of the dashboard instruments, just bright enough to show the heavy sweat rolling down my face. I blinked hard, fighting through a thick, unnatural fog that had taken up residence inside my skull. My heart was slamming against my ribs in a wild, wrong rhythm. I checked the clock on the dashboard. Nearly 7 in the evening. I had been slumped unconscious on the highway shoulder for over 3 hours. I cranked the window down, letting the night air rush in against my face. The cold hit me like a slap and slowly began pulling me back to myself. I am 70 years old, but I spent 35 years as a commercial real estate developer. My entire career was built on spotting discrepancies, reading risk, and catching people hiding the truth. I pressed my head back against the headrest and let the pieces crash together. Dylan and Petra were not worried about my memory. Those white tablets were not Swiss supplements lovingly ordered by my wife. They were powerful sedatives or something darker. They had deliberately pushed unmarked narcotics into my hand moments before I merged onto a winding highway. If my reflexes had been even a fraction slower, my truck would have gone over the edge and into the dark below. It would have been written off as a tragedy. A grieving, senile old man who lost control of his vehicle. I reached across to the passenger seat, fingers shaking as they found the plastic bottle. A wave of pure fury surged through me, scorching away the last of the fog. I hurled the bottle into the darkness outside, listened to it bounce off rock, and heard it vanish into the distance. I pulled a slow, deep breath, grabbed the gear shift, and steered my truck back onto the highway. I was no longer a bewildered, grief-stricken widower. I was a man who had just survived an attempt on his life by his own flesh and blood. The rest of the drive inland passed in a dark blur of winding back roads. I left the highway behind, pushing deeper into the East Texas piney woods as the night closed in around me. By the time my GPS announced I was approaching the property, the sun had dropped below the ridgeline, throwing long, sinister shadows across the land. I swung off the paved road and onto a rutted dirt driveway completely overrun with weeds. The branches of dead and dying trees clawed at the sides of my truck as I inched forward. After a mile or so, the tree line opened up, and the property Lorraine had left me came into view. I shifted into park and sat there staring through the dusty glass. It looked like the backdrop of a cheap horror film. The main farmhouse was barely standing. The porch roof had buckled and caved, the wooden siding was eaten through with rot, and every window was either boarded over or broken out. Tall grass had swallowed the front steps, and a rusted combine sat abandoned in the side yard. A wasteland. This was the peace and quiet Dylan had talked about so smugly. A property so far gone that no one would ever think to come looking for me here. I climbed out. The crunch of dry gravel rang out sharply in the valley's stillness. The air out here was nothing like the coast, dry, motionless, and hollow. I reached behind my seat for a heavy rubber-grip flashlight and clicked it on against the gathering dark. I walked the perimeter of the farmhouse, sweeping the beam across the collapsed roof sections and fractured foundation. Evaluating properties was practically part of my bloodstream. I fell automatically into assessing structural integrity, foundation, settling, and roof load distribution. The verdict was swift. The house was beyond any reasonable repair. A complete teardown. There was no rational explanation for Lorraine, a sharp forensic accountant who had managed our assets with surgical precision, to have quietly held onto a dead property like this for a decade. It made no financial sense whatsoever. She despised dead assets. She hated paying taxes on land that returned nothing. So, why had she held this ruin? And why had she specifically named it as my one and only inheritance? I kept walking past the main structure, boots grinding over dead branches and scattered debris. The property stretched far back into a thick stand of tall trees. As I moved away from the farmhouse, my flashlight arc swept low across the ground, and I stopped dead. Every instinct honed across 3 decades of inspecting construction sites fired at once. The story Dylan had spun was unraveling right beneath my feet. The driveway leading up to the main house was buried under years of untouched overgrowth, but the path that curved past the house toward the back of the property told a completely different story. I crouched low, pressing my flashlight beam directly against the dirt. The earth here was densely compacted and deeply rutted. These were not the marks of a wandering hiker or a curious local. These were fresh, heavy-duty commercial truck tire tracks, the kind left by utility vehicles hauling massive payloads. And there were dozens of them layered over each other, carving a clear and recently traveled road straight through the mud. I straightened up, my pulse climbing again, but this time it had nothing to do with the sedatives. I followed the tracks, letting them pull me deeper into the property. The tree line broke open again, and there it was, a large hulking structure sitting at the far back of the lot. A corrugated metal barn. The exterior had been deliberately painted and weathered to look every bit as derelict and rusted as the main farmhouse. It blended seamlessly into the bleak surroundings. But as I moved closer, running my light along the building's side, the air went out of my lungs. Tucked behind an old wooden utility pole, half swallowed by the tree line, was a thick black electrical cable running straight down its length. I traced the cable with my flashlight as it arced down and fed directly into the side of the rusted barn. It was a brand new industrial-grade 3-phase power line. In commercial real estate, 3-phase lines go in for one reason. You need them to run heavy manufacturing equipment, massive industrial refrigeration systems, or high-density computer server farms. You do not lay an industrial power grid into an abandoned, rotting barn in the middle of nowhere. I lowered my flashlight, slowly edging toward the barn's massive metal doors. Something about the air near the structure felt off. There was a faint, barely perceptible, low-frequency hum vibrating up through the ground and into the soles of my boots. Something inside was pulling an enormous amount of electricity. Why does an abandoned barn have a brand new industrial-grade three-phase power line running into it? And why do fresh heavy-duty tire tracks lead straight to the back of this property? I had to get inside of that barn. But first I turned away from those heavy metal doors and made my way back toward the decaying farmhouse. The night air had grown sharply colder as darkness settled fully over the quiet East Texas piney woods. My heavy work boots scraped softly over dry weeds and deeply cracked earth. I needed to get inside the main house and sit down somewhere I could think. I needed to sit in a secure place and work through the sheer weight of what I had just found. I stepped up onto the wooden porch and shoved open the front door of the farmhouse. Its rusted hinges let out a shriek that tore through the silence like something wounded crying out in the dark. Inside, the air was thick with stale dust, dry rot, and the suffocating smell of decades of abandonment. I swept the beam of my heavy rubber-grip flashlight across the hollow living room. The old floral wallpaper hung from the walls in long, yellowed strips, and the uneven floorboards groaned beneath my weight with every step. A single broken rocking chair sat perfectly in the center of the dark room, covered completely by a thin gray tarp that had gone dingy with age. I pulled the tarp away. A thick cloud of dust erupted into the stale air and lowered myself heavily into it. My mind would not stop turning. The industrial three-phase power line, the fresh heavy-duty tire tracks pressed deep into the mud. The behavior of my late wife, a meticulous, ruthlessly organized woman that was completely at odds with everything I knew about her. Not a single piece of it added up. Yet every hidden detail pointed towards something enormous and tightly guarded being buried on this forgotten stretch of land. Before I could assemble even the beginning of a working theory, my cell phone screamed to life, shattering the dead silence of the empty room. I flinched hard, my exhausted heart lurching straight into my throat. The sound was overwhelming in that hollow, echoing space. I yanked the phone from my jacket pocket, fully expecting to see Alton, the cold estate attorney, calling to wrap up some piece of leftover legal business from the morning. Instead, the bright screen showed a name that turned my blood to ice. Petra, my daughter-in-law. The same woman who just hours ago had pressed a bottle of heavy sedatives into my hand and practically shoved me out the door with a triumphant sneer on her face. What could she possibly want from me now? This far into the evening, I sat there staring at the glowing screen as the phone shook against my palm. Every survival instinct I had built up across 3 decades in cutthroat commercial real estate was screaming at me to let it ring. But a quieter, more tactical voice cut through the noise. Pick it up. I needed to know exactly what she was after. I cleared my throat, forced my face to relax, and swiped to answer. I lifted the phone to my ear and offered a soft, weary hello. The voice that came back at me was almost unrecognizable. Dad, oh, thank goodness you picked up. Did you make it out there all right? Petra asked, her words tumbling out breathlessly. The tone was nothing like the woman I had faced in that hallway. The venom and the cold contempt were completely gone. What had replaced them was a frantic, almost desperate maternal worry, pitched high and trembling with exaggerated anxiety. It was a performance, a transparent one badly staged, but I decided to play along. Yes, Petra, I murmured deliberately, drawing my voice down to something slow and thick and hollow. I made it. I am inside the farmhouse now. Oh, I am so relieved. She rushed on, speaking far too quickly to sound natural. Listen, Dad, have you had a chance to walk the outer property yet? Did you happen to go out to the old barn in the back? Mom always spoke so warmly about that barn. Did she perhaps leave something out there for you? Did you open the big doors? The sharp, rapid precision of her questions hit me like a fist. She had not called to find out whether I had survived that drive. She did not care about my health or my grief. She cared about the barn, the same barn quietly wired into a massive industrial power grid. I knew in that instant that this call was a trap carefully laid. If I told her the truth, if I let slip that I had spotted the tire tracks and the electrical cable, I would be signing my own death warrant before the night was out. I had to make her believe the plan had worked. I needed her to be convinced I was exactly what Dylan had called me earlier, a helpless, confused old man who was no threat to anyone. I sank deeper into the rocking chair, pressed the phone hard against my ear, and let out a long, wretched groan. I slurred my words, dragging every syllable as though each one cost me something. No, Petra, I mumbled, letting my voice shake just enough. I haven't gone outside at all. I am absolutely worn out right now. Those pills you gave me earlier, I got so dizzy on the road. My vision went completely blurry. I can barely hold myself upright. I just dragged myself in here and fell into a chair. I think I could sleep for a week. There is no way I'm walking out into that darkness to look at some old barn. I just need to shut my eyes and rest. A sharp, deliberate pause settled over the line. I could hear her breathing shallow, rapid, calculating her next move. When she finally spoke, the frantic edge had drained away entirely, replaced by a smooth, dark satisfaction that crawled under my skin. "Oh, Dad, I am so sorry the drive wore you out like that," she said softly, her voice rich with a relief she couldn't quite disguise. "You just rest now. Don't worry about the property tonight. Just stay inside and sleep well. We'll talk in a few days. Goodbye." The line cut dead. No, "I love you." No offer to come up and check on me. She simply hung up, coldly satisfied that the unmarked sedatives had done exactly what they were supposed to do. I set the phone down slowly and stared into the darkness of that hollow room. The pieces were finally snapping into place. Those pills were designed to incapacitate me to keep me out of the way, or perhaps to make certain I never woke up from that sleep at all. They needed me completely helpless tonight. I pushed myself up from the rocking chair, my mind running hard and fast through every dangerous possibility. If Petra was that desperate to know whether I had gone near that barn, it meant something of enormous value was inside, something she and my treacherous son needed access to tonight, something worth drugging their own father over. I moved quietly across the groaning floorboards toward the front of the farmhouse. The large bay window in the living room was coated in the years of thick grime, with several jagged cracks running diagonally through the glass. I leaned close and peered through a cleaner section of the broken pane out across the overgrown front yard and the long dirt road winding back toward the main highway. The moon had climbed high enough to throw a pale silver light across the still valley. The night was silent, almost peaceful. I scanned the horizon carefully, watching for any sign of movement. For a moment, there was nothing, just the slow drift of dry brush in the cold wind. Then my eyes caught something in the far distance. About a mile down that rough dirt road, two bright headlights cut hard through the darkness. A large vehicle was bearing steadily toward the property. I held my breath and watched. Then the headlights snapped off completely, the vehicle disappeared into darkness. But I could still hear it, the low rhythmic crunch of heavy tires pressing over loose gravel, moving steadily closer. I pressed my face against the cracked glass, my heart hammering against my ribs. A large black SUV materialized slowly out of the tree-line's shadow, crawling toward the farmhouse at a deliberate predatory crawl, no lights, no noise beyond the gravel beneath its tires. They had not driven all this way to check on my health. They were here to finish what the pills had started. The vehicle rolled to a silent stop near the edge of the overgrown driveway, barely 100 yards from the decaying front porch. The engine went quiet. They sat in the dark, watching the farmhouse, waiting for any sign of life. My heart was pounding, but my mind went cold and precise. Every instinct pushed me toward dialing 911, but I stopped my thumb. Dylan was not simply a greedy son anymore. He was a wealthy, well-connected executive who moved easily among politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials across Southeast Texas. He had bankrolled political campaigns throughout the region. If I called local police in a panic, claiming my son had dispatched hired killers to a remote farm, there was every chance the responding officers already owed him a favor. Or they would simply dismiss me as a delusional old man in cognitive collapse, exactly the narrative Petra had been carefully building. I could not put my life in the hands of strangers who might already be bought. I needed someone I trusted without question, someone who knew how to operate in a violent situation in the dead of night. I scrolled past the emergency numbers and landed on Rufus. Rufus and I had been close friends for over 40 years. Before moving into the private security sector, he had spent 2 decades as a highly decorated reconnaissance Marine, operating in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth. If anyone understood a tactical ambush, it was him. I pressed call and lifted the phone to my ear, breathing shallow. It rang twice before he picked up. His voice was gravelly and alert. I skipped every formality. "Rufus," I whispered into the receiver, my voice tight with controlled fear. "I'm in serious trouble. I'm out at the old East Texas property, the one Lorraine picked up years ago. There's a black vehicle parked just outside the tree line, running dark. They killed the headlights before pulling in, and they're just sitting there. I think Dylan sent them to get rid of me." Silence on the other end. Rufus didn't ask whether I was joking. He didn't question whether I was overreacting. He absorbed the information and responded with pure military efficiency. "Give me your exact coordinates, Jerry," he said, his tone shifting to something cold and controlled. I recited the address from memory, eyes locked on the vehicle outside. "I can be there in 20 minutes if I push it," Rufus said. "Do not engage them under any circumstances. Kill your phone's sound, stay out of sight, and find something heavy you can use if they breach before I get there." "I'm on my way." He was gone. I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket and eased back from the front window, placing each step with precise care to avoid the floorboards that groaned loudest. I needed a weapon, something solid and heavy that could do real damage if it came down to a fight. I moved silently through the dark hallway toward the back of the house, navigating from memory. The kitchen was a desolate room, washed in pale moonlight, filtering through dirty rear windows. I ran my hands across rotting countertops and yanked open a few rusted drawers, nothing but crumbling wood and old dust. Then my boot nudged something hard and cold resting on the floor near the back door. I crouched and swept my hand across the linoleum, my fingers wrapping around a heavy iron crowbar. Rust and old paint flaked off under my grip, left behind by whoever had boarded up the house years ago. But it was solid, well-balanced, and lethal in the right hands. I closed my fist around the cold iron and felt a surge of raw adrenaline push through my exhausted muscles. I was 70 years old, but I was not about to lie down and let my own son order my death without making him pay a price for it. I pressed my back flat against the kitchen wall and reached for the brass handle of the rear door. It resisted stiff in its frame, but I applied slow, steady pressure until the latch gave with a barely audible click. I eased through the gap and stepped out into the freezing night air. The backyard was a tangle of thick brush and dead grass, standing knee-high, offering solid natural cover. I crouched low, letting the vegetation swallow my silhouette, and worked my way carefully around the side of the house toward the front driveway. Every step was deliberate, no snapped twigs, no dry branches underfoot. When I finally reached the corner of the rotting porch, I went still and peered through the brush. The doors of the black SUV swung open without a sound. 2 men stepped out onto the gravel. These were not street criminals or hired muscle pulled from a local contact list. They were dressed head to toe in high-end black tactical gear, heavy Kevlar vests, dark combat boots, faces completely hidden behind black fabric masks. Each carried a sleek firearm, fitted with a long cylindrical suppressor. These were trained professionals. Their movements were synchronized and utterly devoid of hesitation. Every signal passed through hand gestures without a single spoken word. One of them reached into a chest pouch and produced a compact electronic device. Even from where I was crouching in the darkness, I recognized the glowing interface of a biometric bypass scanner, specialized equipment used exclusively by high-end security firms to crack advanced digital locking systems. Why would a hit team need a biometric scanner to get into a crumbling farmhouse? The answer came almost immediately. The 2 armed men did not move toward the front porch. They didn't spare a glance at the broken windows of the main house where they presumably believed I was unconscious, sleeping off a heavy dose of narcotics. Instead, they gave the farmhouse no attention at all, turning their backs to it completely. Weapons raised in a ready position, they moved in silence through the wet grass, making straight for the massive metal barn sitting at the far edge of the property. I didn't exist to them. Their only target was whatever Lorraine had locked away behind those heavy doors. My fingers tightened around the rusted iron crowbar. Breathing shallow and steady, I held my position until their dark shapes were 50 yards out, swallowed almost entirely by the night. Then I stepped clear of the brush, lowered my center of gravity, and fell in behind them, planting each boot carefully inside their own muddy prints so I made no sound. The night cold cut into my lungs with every step. The tall, browning grass dragged across my jacket, but I kept my pace agonizingly slow, making sure not a single blade snapped beneath me. 50 yards shrank to 15. The faint green glow of their tactical vest lights was now clearly visible. They stood right before those massive corrugated metal doors, exchanging hushed, clipped words. One worked the biometric scanner near the doorframe, while the other kept his suppressed rifle up. The crowbar in my hands had turned my forearms into 2 cramps. I was 70 years old. Fit for my age, sure, but throwing myself at 2 trained operatives in their prime was borderline suicidal. Still, the knowledge that Dylan had sent these men to kill me burned every trace of fear right out of me. I was about to step out from behind a rotting tractor tire, and bring that iron bar down on the nearest man when a dark shape peeled itself silently away from the tree line to my right. A large hand sealed tight over my mouth, and a powerful arm locked my chest hard against cold metal. I fought it for a fraction of a second before a familiar gravelly voice came low into my ear. "It is just me, Jerry. Stay perfectly still." Rufus had arrived. He released my mouth and dropped into a crouch beside me in the mud. He was dressed all in dark colors, and he moved with a liquid stillness that seemed impossible for a man his age. He didn't ask if I was all right. He just read the tactical situation laid out in front of us with the cold precision of a machine. 2 tangos heavy armor suppressed rifles. Rufus breathed the words, eyes fixed on them. "We take them at the same time, on my mark. I go left, you go right. Don't aim for the head or chest they're wearing Kevlar. Go for the back of the knees. Put them in the dirt and I handle everything after that." "Understood." I gave a single nod, my heart slamming hard against my ribs. I reset my grip on the iron crowbar palms slick with sweat. Rufus raised 3 fingers in the thin moonlight, then 2, then 1. We came out of the brush like a pair of shadows. Pure surprise was all we had going for us, and I burned through whatever adrenaline my body had left in reserve to close the distance fast. The guard on the right caught the crunch of gravel under my boots and started to spin, swinging his weapon up toward my chest. He was just a beat too slow. I brought the crowbar down in a hard, low arc, exactly where Rufus had told me to aim. The heavy iron connected with the back of the man's right knee and produced a sickening wet crack. A muffled, agonized grunt escaped him as his leg folded entirely, and he pitched into the mud. His weapon tumbled free, ringing harmlessly off the barn siding. He hadn't even begun to recover when Rufus was already finishing his own man. He'd closed the distance in complete silence, locking one massive forearm around the first guard's neck in a chokehold. There was no breaking out of sweeping the man's legs simultaneously. The guard bucked and struggled, but the former Marine's grip was a vice that choked off all blood to the brain. Inside 10 seconds, the man went limp and dropped into the mud like a discarded rag doll. My target was still squirming, clawing desperately for a tactical knife strapped to his thigh. I moved in and drove the heel of my work boot down hard onto his wrist, pinning his hand flat to the ground. Rufus was already there, leaving his unconscious man behind and launching himself onto mine. One single devastating blow to the side of the jaw. The guard's eyes went blank and his body went slack. The whole violent exchange was finished in under 30 seconds. The night folded back around us in dead silence, broken only by the ragged pull of my own breath. I stood there in the dark chest, heaving, staring down at 2 motionless men in the dirt. My arms wouldn't stop trembling from the adrenaline flooding through me, and my knees felt hollow. I leaned hard against the cold metal siding of the barn, using the crowbar as a prop to stay upright. Rufus didn't waste so much as a breath, celebrating what we'd just pulled off. He reached into his jacket and produced a bundle of heavy-duty plastic zip ties. He rolled the first guard onto his stomach, crossed the man's arms behind his back, and cinched the wrists with efficient brutality. He repeated it on the second man, yanking the thick plastic bands until they bit deep into skin. Then, he bound their ankles, making sure neither man could walk or fight even if he came around. "Watch the tree line," Rufus muttered, quickly working through the men's tactical vests with practiced hands. "Make certain they didn't leave a driver sitting in that vehicle." I swept my eyes along the dark road, studying the motionless outline of the black SUV parked far back. Nothing stirred. We had the property to ourselves. Rufus stripped both men of their suppressed firearms and pitched the weapons deep into the tall weeds beyond recovery. He checked their ankle holsters, pocketed 2 tactical knives, then went through the cargo pockets of their combat pants. Out came encrypted cell phones, a small flashlight, and the sophisticated biometric scanner they'd been attempting to use on the barn door. I moved in closer and aimed my light at the pile of items in the mud. "Check them for ID," I said barely above a whisper. Rufus went into the first guard's vest and came out with something small. He wiped the mud off and brought it into the light. It was a sleek, heavy electronic keycard, matte black face, a prominent silver logo stamped on the front. The air went out of me the moment I saw it. I knew that shape without having to think. It was the exact same emblem printed on the business cards my son had handed me with such pride 3 months ago for his brand new private investment firm in Houston. My own child had sent his corporate security operatives to have me killed. Rufus didn't offer empty words. He simply pressed the card flat to a hidden sensor on the barn frame. A heavy electronic lock released with a deep resonant clack. I hauled the corrugated metal door open. There was no rotting wood inside, none of what a barn is supposed to hold. I went completely still. Standing 3 feet past the wooden exterior was a massive reinforced steel bulkhead. It had the look of a military bunker entrance, thick titanium hinges, a glowing digital retinal scanner mounted to the frame. I stood frozen in the cold air staring at that scanner. The scale of engineering concealed inside this decaying structure was almost incomprehensible. The steel plating and titanium hardware were built to survive a military assault. Rufus stepped past me, his combat boots silent on the concrete slab just inside the wooden threshold. He examined the inner door the way a man examines something he has seen 100 times before, without emotion. He ran one gloved hand along the seamless joint where steel met concrete. No external wiring, no power boxes, no keyholes, he said quietly. This is a closed-loop biometric system. The key card from the guards only opened the outer shell. Getting through this inner bulkhead means a direct retinal scan, or a master override punched straight into that keypad. Without the biometrics breaching this door, takes shape charges, and we don't have them. I moved closer to the red glow of the panel, my mind pulling hard through decades of memory. Dylan and Petra clearly didn't have the biometrics or the bypass code. That was exactly why they had dispatched a specialized team carrying an advanced hacking device. But this bunker had nothing to do with my son. It belonged to Lorraine. She had planned every detail of our lives, our finances, our future with meticulous care. Spreadsheets, encrypted passwords, redundant fail-safes, that was how she lived. If she had constructed this underground fortress in total secrecy, she would never have left me with no way inside. She understood my limitations with technology, and she knew that sooner or later I would find my way to this property. I stood staring at the keypad glowing beneath the optical lens, searching for an answer. The blinking cursor was waiting for a 10-digit sequence. My chest compressed as a painful memory forced itself forward. I thought of those final days in the sterile hospital room with Lorraine. The cancer had been tearing through her body, and the heavy morphine doses were eroding her remarkable mind along with it. In those last agonizing 48 hours, she had moved in and out of consciousness, murmuring softly to herself. Dylan had stood in the corner of the room, checking his phone loudly, complaining that his mother was losing her grip on reality. At the time, I had sadly agreed. Lorraine kept repeating the same specific string of numbers, her frail hand gripping mine with a strength that surprised me. 4792. She breathed those digits over and over her clouded eyes, finding mine with an intensity I foolishly wrote off as the confusion of a dying woman. I had spent those hours stroking her hair, telling her to rest completely blind to the urgent message she was trying to press into my hands before she was gone. She was not losing her mind. She was giving me the key. A deep wave of grief and sudden clarity rolled through me all at once. Lorraine had known her time was nearly gone, and she had known she couldn't trust our son. She used the last clear moments she had to hand me the exact combination I would need to find the truth. But 4 digits weren't enough. The interface required a full 10-digit sequence. I shut my eyes and blocked out the low hum of the industrial power grid pulsing through the concrete under my feet. I needed to think the way Lorraine thought. She was a woman of deep sentiment housed inside ruthlessly practical logic. If she needed a 10-digit code, one she was certain I would never forget, she would weave her secret numbers together with the most important date in our shared life, our wedding anniversary. August 14th, 1981. Year away from 1981. 8 digits. Dropping the century gave me 6. 081482. Paired with the 4 numbers she had whispered from her deathbed, it came to exactly 10. Rufus watched me without a word as I raised my trembling hand toward the glowing red keypad. The cool night air felt like it had disappeared entirely, replaced by a suffocating pressure. If the code was wrong, a system this sophisticated would slam into hard lockdown, sealing the steel door and instantly alerting whoever was watching the security grid. I drew a slow breath and let the memory of Lorraine guide my fingers. I entered the first 6 digits. 081482. The keypad answered with a series of soft electronic tones as it registered the input. I stopped for half a heartbeat, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Then I entered the final 4 numbers she had given me. 4792. I pressed the green confirmation key and stepped back, holding everything still inside me. 3 agonizing seconds. Nothing. The red optical scanner blinked on and off in slow, steady rhythm processing. Then the light shifted hard and sudden to a bright, vivid green. A deep mechanical thud resonated from somewhere inside the thick steel wall, and right behind it came the unmistakable hiss of hydraulic seals releasing pressure. The titanium hinges groaned under the weight as the massive bulkhead began to swing outward, pushing a rush of crisp, chilled air into the dusty outer barn. Rufus immediately raised his confiscated tactical knife and stepped in front of me as the heavy door opened fully. But no threat was waiting for us inside, only the steady rhythmic hum of powerful electronics. We moved carefully over the thick steel threshold and crossed into a completely different world. The interior of the bunker was pristine, climate-controlled, spotlessly clean, silent. The walls were lined with heavy soundproofing panels that swallowed the howling wind outside completely. Bright, sterile LED lights blinked on, automatically flooding rows of tall, black server racks with cold white light. Thousands of small green and blue indicator lights pulsed across the hardware as it churned through an enormous volume of encrypted data. Thick cable bundles ran from the servers down into the concrete floor, pulling power from the hidden industrial line outside. This was not a simple storage room. It was a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar off-grid data center. Rufus swept the space with a tactical eye, scanning for hidden cameras or silent alarm triggers. At the far end of the long rectangular room, beyond the endless rows of encrypted servers, stood another massive titanium structure, a heavily reinforced walk-in banking vault gleaming cold under the fluorescent lights. The sheer capital required to secretly build and maintain all of this beneath a crumbling barn was almost impossible to fathom. But it wasn't the servers or the vault that turned my blood to ice. Sitting perfectly centered on a polished stainless steel desk in the middle of the room, caught in the beam of a single overhead light, was a pristine white envelope. I walked slowly down the aisle between the humming racks, my boots ringing against the polished concrete with every step. As I drew closer, the handwriting on the envelope came into unmistakable focus. Bold, deliberate strokes in thick black ink, addressed simply for my beloved husband, Gerald. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lift the envelope from the desk. The thick paper felt impossibly heavy, as though it carried the full weight of a voice reaching toward me from the other side. I ran my thumb across my name, tracing the familiar curves of Lorraine's handwriting. Beside me, Rufus stood as a quiet, motionless sentinel. He drifted to the edge of the room and positioned himself near the open steel bulkhead eyes, working the dark perimeter of the barn outside. He understood exactly what this moment was. He was making sure no one could take it from me. I drew a slow, ragged breath, let the bunker's chilled, filtered air settle into my lungs, and carefully broke the wax seal on the back of the envelope. I unfolded the thick parchment inside. The date at the top had been written 3 weeks before she was admitted to the hospital for the last time. The ink was faintly smudged in places, as if her hands had been unsteady, or her eyes wet while she wrote. I swallowed against the knot rising in my throat and began to read. "My dearest Gerald," she wrote, and those words alone opened something in my chest that I could barely contain. "If you are standing in this room, it means my worst fears came true. It means I am gone, and it means you followed the trail I left behind and found the terrible truth about our family. I am so sorry for keeping you in the dark these past 2 years. I needed to protect you, and the only way to do that to keep you safe from the crossfire was to make you appear to be a harmless, unknowing old man. Please forgive me for the deception. I did not build this bunker because I was losing my mind, and I did not change my last will and testament out of spite or cruelty. I did it because I uncovered something deeply terrifying about our son, and I needed time to secure what we truly built together before he could take it all and dismantle everything we spent our lives creating." I tightened my grip on the paper, my knuckles going white. Lorraine had always been a masterful forensic accountant, a brilliant woman capable of catching a single misplaced decimal in a mountain of financial records. The letter pressed on, mapping out a nightmare I could barely hold in my mind. 2 years ago, Dylan asked me to look over the early financial ledgers for his new private investment firm, she wrote. He expected me to skim the top-line profits and tell him how proud I was, but I looked deeper. I followed the hidden money trails Gerald. I traced the routing numbers, the offshore shell companies, the layered dummy accounts he and Petra were quietly building out. Our son is not a legitimate investment banker. He is running a massive, highly sophisticated money laundering operation for a notorious international cartel. He is moving millions of dollars in illicit drug money through the domestic real estate market, and he was planning to use your development company as his primary washing machine. A wave of cold nausea moved through my body. My vision blurred as the full horror of it landed. The unmarked white pills, the sudden aggressive transfer of the luxury penthouse, the heavily armed tactical team sent out to this remote farm. What I was about to uncover on that property would shatter everything I thought I understood about the people closest to me. Before we get there, tell me in the comments, if you suspected someone you loved was secretly working against you, would you confront them immediately or stay quiet and gather the truth first? It all snapped into place with a terrifying clarity now. Dylan and Petra weren't simply greedy children circling an inheritance. They were desperate criminals pinned inside a high-stakes underworld, and they had come to see me as a massive liability that needed to be neutralized. If Dylan had succeeded in seizing my real estate portfolio, he would have dragged my clean name straight into a federal investigation, or worse, put me directly in the sights of a ruthless criminal syndicate. Lorraine had worked it all out, and she had spent her final painful years quietly dismantling his plans from the inside, right under his nose. I wiped a single tear from my cheek and kept reading. I knew that confronting Dylan directly would only cause him to panic and try to silence me, she wrote. So I played the part, a declining paranoid mother slipping away. I used my financial connections to quietly liquidate the bulk of our liquid holdings, the stock portfolios, the mutual funds, the overseas accounts. I converted over $40 million into untraceable decentralized assets and secured physical bonds. The true family fortune is here in this vault, completely beyond his reach. I left him the luxury penthouse and the visible bank accounts, a shiny distraction, a pacifier to keep him busy, while I finished moving our real wealth to safety. He thinks he won Gerald. He thinks he outmaneuvered us both and walked away with the crown jewels. But he only took the bait. The final sentences of the letter were pressed into the page with a fierce protective weight that practically radiated from the paper. The pen strokes were dark and deliberate. I slowed as I read the most chilling lines of all. If you are reading this, Gerald, my heart finally gave out, or they helped it give out. Open the safe. Don't let our son destroy your life. The air inside the bunker felt several degrees colder in an instant. My breath locked in my throat as the full meaning of those words reached me. Lorraine had known her illness would kill her, but she had also strongly suspected that Dylan and Petra were actively speeding that process along to unlock the estate. They had likely used the same heavy sedatives on her that Petra had slipped into my hand just hours earlier. They had killed my wife. A low, ragged sound escaped me, raw grief, with nothing refined about it. Rufus turned his head slowly, his dark eyes holding mine, with a quiet, steady understanding. He said nothing, he didn't need to. The set of his body said it clearly, he was prepared to go to war beside me. I folded the heavy parchment with care and slid it into the inner pocket of my jacket. The grief that had been crushing me for the past month began to change shape as I stood there. It compressed, hardened, sharpened into something cold and unbreakable, a spear of righteous fury, with a very specific target. I was no longer a bewildered old widower mourning the loss of his wife. I was a man who had just learned his own son was a calculating murderer, and my remarkable wife had just placed the ultimate weapon in my hands. I turned from the desk and walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the massive titanium vault dominating the far wall. My fingers reached out steady, now no longer shaking, and I used the final code in the letter to work the dial. The heavy door swung open, revealing stacks of documents that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about my own life. I stood in the cool, sterile light of the bunker, taking in what was arranged on those shelves. There was no cash, no gold, but to a man who had spent his life in real estate development, what I was looking at was worth more than either. The shelves were immaculately organized with thick waterproof portfolios, bound ledgers, and stacked pages of heavy parchment. I reached out and pulled the first banded bundle from the top shelf. Bearer bonds. I worked through the embossed pages, my breath tightening, as I tallied the denominations in my head. Millions of dollars in untraceable certificates right there in my hands. I set them beside Lorraine's letter on the steel desk and reached back into the vault. Next came thick files deeds and transfer documents for high-yield offshore accounts registered in jurisdictions far outside the reach of American financial regulators or a scheming son. Alongside them sat sealed envelopes holding mineral rights and land patents for properties I hadn't even known we owned. I stood motionless, calculating the staggering scope of what was laid out in front of me. The combined value of these assets cleared $80 million without question. It was almost incomprehensible. While she was battling terminal cancer and performing the role of a fading, fragile old woman, my wife had executed a financial masterclass. She had methodically and invisibly drained the bulk of our legitimate wealth from every exposed account, quietly converting vulnerable assets and routing every dollar into this fortified underground chamber. The crumbling farmhouse above us was nothing more than an expertly crafted decoy, a dead asset purchased specifically to conceal an $80 million empire from a son who thought he was the one doing the manipulating. A wave of deep awe and profound sorrow moved through me in equal measure. Lorraine had moved mountains to protect everything we had built together from Dylan and his treacherous wife. She had kept total financial ruin from my door. But as I stood before those towering stacks of documents, a sharp question cut through the quiet. If Lorraine had deliberately stripped our primary accounts to keep our wealth from our son, why had she specifically amended her will to leave him the $12 million luxury penthouse? That penthouse was our crown jewel, the defining symbol of everything we had achieved. It was a high-profile asset carrying crippling property taxes and steep maintenance costs. It ran completely counter to a plan designed to leave him holding nothing of value. I frowned into the cold bunker air, a new kind of alertness moving through me. There had to be a reason. Lorraine never acted without calculated purpose. I went back to the vault, running my hands along the deeper shelves toward the back. Tucked into the far bottom corner, deliberately separated from the bearer bonds and offshore deeds, was a thick, bright red folder. A single word was written across it in Lorraine's sharp handwriting: liability. I carried the red folder to the desk, untied the string closure, and opened it. Inside were dozens of pages of dense forensic accounting ledgers, highlighted pathways threading through rows of figures that Lorraine had painstakingly traced. She had tracked every financial transaction connected to that penthouse over the past 24 months. What those pages showed turned the air in my lungs to ice. The $12 million penthouse was not a free and clear asset. It was dangerously fully leveraged. Dylan had used his access to our accounts and Petra's legal connections to quietly take out multiple large, high-interest loans against the property without my knowledge or consent. But the loans were only the beginning of something far worse. Lorraine's notes laid out a horrifying web of illicit financial activity in painstaking detail. Dylan and Petra had been using the penthouse as a clean, legitimate-looking front to launder millions of dollars for a violent international drug cartel running dirty money through fabricated renovation costs, phantom contractor invoices, and layers of dummy shell companies all tied directly to the address of our home. They had turned our beautiful home into the central hub of a major criminal enterprise. The scale of what they had built was breathtaking, and the implications were devastating. I gripped the edge of the steel desk to keep myself upright as the full truth locked into place. If Lorraine had allowed that penthouse to pass to me through the will, I would have inherited sole legal ownership of a massive money laundering front. My name, and only my name, would have been on that deed when federal authorities came through the door. The FBI would have arrested me, frozen every asset I had left, and put me in a federal prison cell for whatever remained of my life. Or worse, the cartel would have eventually sensed the federal net closing in. They would have needed a disposable name to absorb the blame for their missing millions. They would have put me in the ground and left my body somewhere to close the loose end permanently. Lorraine had seen the trap Dylan had built for me. She had seen the federal indictments and the cartel's enforcers waiting in the shadows. And so, in her final act of fierce love and quiet protection, my brilliant wife had flipped the trap completely. She had deliberately handed the penthouse to Dylan. She had intentionally transferred legal ownership of his own criminal hub straight into his hands. She had removed my name from the blast radius and cinched a noose firmly around our son's treacherous neck. She gave him the penthouse so he could hang himself with his own rope. He believed he had outwitted us both and secured a massive asset, never once realizing his mother had just legally chained him to a ticking bomb. I stared down at the bright red folder, a cold, dangerous smile working its way across my face. Lorraine had not simply saved my life. She had placed in my hands the perfect weapon to dismantle the corrupt people who had tried to bury me. I closed the red folder carefully and tucked it into my left jacket pocket beside her letter. The raw, paralyzing grief that had been eating through me for weeks was gone. In its place sat something cold and precise. I turned from the desk and walked back toward the open steel bulkhead, stepping out of the bunker and into the dim interior of the barn. Rufus was standing right where I'd left him. "Let's wake our sleeping guests," I said quietly. "We have a great deal of work still ahead of us tonight." Rufus gave a single silent nod, his face unreadable under the harsh fluorescent light. We left the two mercenaries trussed up in the freezing mud and made our way back through the heavy titanium doors into the climate-controlled bunker. The hum of the towering black server racks carried a different meaning now. It was no longer just the sound of hidden wealth. It was the mechanical heartbeat of Lorraine's final desperate reach across the grave to find me. I set the red folder on the polished steel desk and turned my attention to the primary computer terminal. Rufus moved past me, pulling up a heavy tactical keyboard wired directly into the master server. His fingers moved across the keys with the practiced efficiency of a military intelligence officer. Lorraine had constructed an impenetrable digital fortress, but she had also left the front gate standing open for anyone who arrived with the correct biometric clearance and the bypass code. A bright blue screen bloomed to life, washing Rufus's face in pale light. He navigated into the primary directory, pulling up a neatly ordered list of encrypted files. Thousands of financial ledgers, wire transfer receipts, and offshore banking logs filled the screen. But one folder on the main desktop stood apart immediately. It was labeled with my name, and beneath it sat a subfolder titled simply Investigator Files. I leaned over Rufus's broad shoulder, a cold dread tightening in my chest. Lorraine had retained a private investigator before she died. She knew the people surrounding her were dangerous, and she had needed documented, undeniable proof of what they were capable of. Rufus opened the folder. A long list of high-definition video files populated the screen. Each file was labeled with a precise date and timestamp. Those dates lined up exactly with the final 2 weeks Lorraine had spent in the VIP wing of Houston Methodist Hospital. My heart drove hard against my ribs, as the implication of that settled over me like ice water. She had instructed her investigator to plant hidden cameras inside her own hospital room. She had wanted every moment of those final days captured and preserved in this vault. Rufus glanced up at me, his dark eyes carrying a quiet, heavy warning. "Are you absolutely sure you are prepared to watch this, Jerry?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard against the tightness in my throat and gave a single nod. "Play the last video," I said, my voice thin in the humming silence of the room. Rufus double-clicked the final file on the list. The video player expanded across the monitor. The high-definition footage showed Lorraine lying perfectly still in her hospital bed, surrounded by a web of medical monitors and IV lines. She looked so terribly fragile the illness had consumed her almost entirely. The timestamp in the corner placed the recording on a Tuesday evening, less than 3 hours before the hospital declared her gone. A suffocating sorrow settled over me as I watched her chest rise and fall with such labored effort. Then the quiet of the room was shattered. The heavy door to her hospital room swung open. Dylan and Petra walked into frame. They were impeccably dressed, entirely unmoved by the gravity of where they were. Dylan wore a tailored charcoal suit, and Petra clutched a designer crocodile skin clutch. They positioned themselves at the foot of Lorraine's bed and looked down at my dying wife with a cold, detached impatience that turned my stomach. Dylan checked his wristwatch and let out a long, irritated breath. The hidden camera's audio was crisp and clear, pulling in every word spoken in that quiet room. "The cartel needs the penthouse transferred to my name by Friday," Dylan said, his voice carrying no trace of grief, of love, of anything human. "She is taking entirely too long to die." Those words hit me like a fist. My own son, the boy I had raised, protected, and provided for his entire life, was standing over his mother's deathbed and complaining that she was inconveniencing a criminal syndicate by refusing to go faster. I stopped breathing. Petra stepped forward with a chilling, deliberate grace. She unzipped her crocodile skin clutch and produced a small, unmarked medical syringe loaded with a clear liquid. "We cannot afford to wait for nature, Dylan," Petra murmured, her voice carrying a dark, flat pragmatism. "If the transfer slips past Friday, those people will come for us. They will not accept condolences from a grieving family. I watched the screen with my hands locked around the edge of the steel desk, knuckles aching from the pressure. Petra moved to the side of the hospital bed. She leaned over my helpless wife with a face completely empty of expression and pushed the clear liquid directly into Lorraine's primary IV line. The effect was almost immediate. Lorraine's frail body arched violently off the mattress. She convulsed her arms, thrashing weakly against the white sheets. Every monitor beside her bed exploded into red alerts, shrieking in frantic alarm. Dylan did not move to take her hand. He did not call for the nurses. He stood perfectly still, watching his mother fight for her last breaths, with the detached calm of a man watching something of no particular consequence. 10 seconds later, Lorraine went still. The monitors flatlined into a single, endless electronic wail. Petra calmly dropped the empty syringe into the medical waste bin, smoothed down her skirt, and moved toward the door. "It is done," she said without inflection. "Call the nurses and start crying." The footage kept rolling, capturing Dylan sinking dramatically to his knees and burying his face in his hands as the medical staff came flooding into the room. It was a perfect, sickening performance. My own son had murdered his mother for a piece of real estate. He had allowed his treacherous wife to kill the woman who brought him into the world, all to satisfy the bloody demands of an international drug cartel. I stood frozen in the cold bunker, staring at the paused image of Lorraine's lifeless body on that glowing screen. The grief that had been crushing my soul for weeks dissolved in an instant. The sorrow burned off into the chilled air, and what replaced it was something altogether different, an icy absolute rage that ran hotter than anything I had ever felt. The betrayal was total, unforgivable, and purely evil. They had killed her, and they had come for me tonight. My fingers found the iron crowbar in my pocket. I was going to take their entire world apart piece by piece. But before I could put that intention into words for Rufus, the bunker erupted into chaos. The overhead fluorescent lights convulsed and died. Then a massive alarm tore through the night, screaming across the property. The outer perimeter system had triggered. The blaring sirens hammered endlessly into the dark. Rufus didn't flinch. He spun immediately from the glowing server rack and crossed to a secondary command console against the far wall, fingers driving hard across the keyboard. A bank of high-definition security monitors blinked to life. Lorraine had not only built a financial vault down here, she had engineered a military-grade surveillance network blanketing every corner of the East Texas property. I rushed to Rufus's side, heart pounding furiously as the dark screens flickered and revealed a dozen infrared and night vision camera feeds. What materialized before my eyes stopped the air in my lungs. The 2 scouts we had left bound in the mud were not the operation. They were just the tip of a massive, heavily armed spear. Through the high-resolution optical sensors, I watched in pure horror as the rotting wooden gates at the property entrance were blown apart into a shower of jagged splinters. 4 massive matte black armored SUVs came tearing up the dirt driveway in an aggressive surge. Stealth was no longer part of their plan. Blinding high-beam headlights and roof-mounted light bars flooded the overgrown property, throwing long, menacing shadows across the dead grass. The heavy vehicles held a tight, synchronized tactical formation as they churned through the mud and flattened the dry brush under their reinforced tires. They gave the rotting farmhouse no attention at all. Their drivers knew exactly where the real target sat. They accelerated hard toward the rear of the lot and fanned out around the corrugated metal barn in a disciplined semicircular blockade. All 4 armored doors swung open at once. More than a dozen heavily armed men spilled out into the freezing night. These were not street-level criminals or run-of-the-mill security contractors. They were seasoned cartel enforcers, heavy tactical plate carriers over dark clothing, faces hidden behind black balaclavas. I tracked them through the glowing monitors as they moved with fluid, terrifying precision, spreading out to lock down the barn's perimeter. Fully automatic rifles, heavy breaching equipment, specialized siege gear, they had come prepared to overwhelm whatever stood in their way. The cold, mechanical reality of it settled over me like concrete. This was a dedicated kill squad. They had been sent to wipe every trace of human life from this property and gut the bunker to its bones. But it was the lead vehicle's arrival that truly stopped my blood. The armored door of the primary SUV swung open, and 2 unmistakable figures stepped into the glare of the headlights. It was Dylan and Petra. The polished facade of wealthy Houston investment bankers was entirely gone. Dylan wore a dark tactical jacket, his face pale and twisted with a mix of frantic desperation and cold fury. Petra stood close beside him, the calculating cruelty in her eyes visible even through the grain of the night vision feed. They hadn't stayed back in their luxury penthouse waiting for a phone call confirming my accidental death. They had come here in person to watch me die. The realization hit me with the force of something unstoppable. Lorraine's forensic accounting ledgers had mapped it out perfectly. Dylan and Petra were not criminal masterminds running a smooth operation. They were drowning in a lethal, inescapable debt to a brutal international cartel. They had used their luxury real estate dealings to launder millions in dirty money, and somewhere along the way, they had lost or burned through an enormous portion of the cartel's capital. The enforcers surrounding this barn hadn't come to serve my son. They were his violent handlers. Dylan and Petra owed their bosses a fortune, and their lives were hanging by a single fraying thread. The $80 million locked inside this underground vault was the only thing standing between them and a death sentence. That was the whole reason Petra had pressed those heavy sedatives into my hand earlier today. The plan had been for me to drive out to this remote property, fall asleep, and never wake up a quiet, chemically induced heart attack. With me gone, Dylan could step in as the sole surviving heir, claim the bunker, and hand Lorraine's meticulously protected fortune directly to his cartel handlers. They had counted on using my death to buy their own freedom. My mind churned as I stared at the glowing monitors, watching my own son coordinate a siege against my life. Every trace of the grief that had been pressing down on me for the past month had burned away. It had been replaced by something harder and colder. They had murdered the woman I loved, and now they were here to finish what they started. Rufus stood at my shoulder, eyes locked on the tactical displays reading the enemy deployment with the detached logic of a combat veteran. We have a reinforced titanium bulkhead and a completely self-sustaining air filtration system. Rufus said, his gravelly voice remarkably level, given what was unfolding outside. They cannot breach that door with standard explosives without collapsing the entire barn structure on top of themselves. We are secure in here for now, Jerry, but we have no way out. We are completely boxed in. I nodded slowly, my hand drifting into my jacket pocket to rest against the thick parchment of Lorraine's letter. We didn't need to run. We only needed to last long enough to expose them. On the monitors, I watched Dylan wave frantically toward the front of the barn. Two cartel enforcers moved forward in a cautious sweep, weapons up, mounted lights cutting through the dark. It took them only seconds to find the two unconscious scouts Rufus and I had zip-tied in the mud. They shouted something unintelligible, swinging their weapons toward the surrounding shadows. Dylan's face went white, a mask of raw, uncontrolled panic, as he looked down at his neutralized men. The realization hit him instantly. His clean, chemically orchestrated assassination plan had collapsed entirely. I was not asleep inside the farmhouse. I was not a confused and helpless old man. I was awake, I was aware, and I was sealed inside the one place that held his only way out. Dylan grabbed a heavy megaphone from the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. He marched into the center of the dirt clearing, flanked immediately by two armed guards, and raised it to his lips. His voice rolled across the silent property and pressed through the thick soundproofing of the bunker in a distorted metallic wave. "Dad, we know you are in the bunker. Open the door, hand over the bonds, and we will make your death quick, just like Mom's." The echo of those words faded into the soundproofed walls and left a chilling silence behind. Just like Mom's. The cruelty of it, using his mother's murder as a tool to break me, produced the exact opposite of what he intended. It didn't crack my resolve. It forged it. I felt no fear. A cold mechanical clarity had taken over my mind entirely. Rufus moved without needing a word from me. He stepped away from the security monitors and went straight to the main control panel beside the titanium bulkhead. A rapid sequence of keystrokes triggered the secondary lockdown protocols. Steel deadbolts thick as tree trunks slammed home around the door's perimeter in a series of heavy resonant thuds. The hydraulic seals pressurized, further transforming the room into a genuine subterranean fortress. "Let them throw themselves against that steel," Rufus said quietly, eyes tracing the reinforced seams. "They will not get through without heavy ordnance, and if they use explosives, they bury the prize they came to collect." I turned from the sealed door and walked back to the polished steel desk. The monitors still glowed with the frozen image of Lorraine's hospital room, a haunting reminder of precisely what this fight was for. I lowered myself into the heavy chair and drew the tactical keyboard toward me. Lorraine had anticipated every move Dylan would make. She had hidden the fortune, documented the murder, and charted the cartel's entire money laundering operation. But she was far too methodical to leave this bunker as a passive storage chamber. She would have built a weapon, a final failsafe engineered to annihilate her killers if they ever managed to breach the perimeter. I navigated out of the video files and into the primary directory of the master server. I opened the folder, holding the forensic accounting ledgers and offshore routing numbers. I scanned the digital architecture carefully, hunting for anything anomalous, anything that had the shape of a trigger. It took less than 3 minutes to find it. Buried deep in the system registry, disguised beneath a string of numerical codes that matched our wedding anniversary, exactly was a single executable file. Not a document, not a spreadsheet, a sophisticated automated command program. The file was titled Dead Man's Switch. My hands hovered above the keys as I examined the hidden program's properties. Lorraine had built a massive digital payload. It was designed to cut through standard commercial firewalls and route through a heavily encrypted virtual private network, transmitting data simultaneously to multiple federal agencies at the highest level. I pulled up the routing instructions. The primary recipients were the local field office of the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Cyber Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She hadn't just prepared a defense. She had built an inescapable digital execution for our son and his cartel handlers. I stared at the blinking cursor, feeling the full crushing weight of what came next, pressing down on me. If I ran this file, there was no going back. The instant that data packet reached the federal servers, Dylan and Petra would become the most wanted targets in the United States government's crosshairs. The cartel would know within moments that their domestic money laundering hub had been utterly destroyed, and they would mercilessly pursue everyone connected to it. My son had stepped across a boundary that could never be walked back. He had chosen money over family. He had chosen greed over his mother's survival. He had chosen to stand outside this bunker alongside armed killers who were hungry to murder his own father. Any room left for parental forgiveness had long since burned away. I drew a slow, measured breath, letting the cold air of the server room settle into my chest, and pressed the enter key with quiet resolve. The blue screen went instantly white, stark, and blinding. A command prompt snapped open, lines of dense code racing across it as the automated program surged to life. A progress bar appeared at the center of the display, tracking the enormous data upload. I watched with grim satisfaction as Lorraine's final act of vengeance shot out into the digital void. The system was busy encrypting and transmitting the damning high-definition footage of Petra pushing that fatal dose into Lorraine's IV line. At the same time, it was pushing every page of the forensic accounting ledgers, meticulously documenting the fraudulent renovations and ghost shell companies tied to the luxury penthouse. It pulled together all the concealed offshore routing numbers, laying the cartel's secret financial network completely bare. The transmission speed was staggering. Drawing on a dedicated fiber optic line, Lorraine had quietly run alongside the industrial power grid. 10%, 30%, 60%. I watched the green bar crawl across the screen, knowing that with each passing megabyte, the invisible noose around Dylan's neck was drawing tighter. He was standing out there in the freezing mud, demanding bearer bonds and mineral rights, completely blind to the fact that his entire criminal world was being hand-delivered to federal prosecutors at that very moment. 90%. 100%. The screen blazed a bright green confirmation. Payload delivered. The evidence was gone, locked safely in the hands of the authorities. The trap had been sprung completely and without any possibility of reversal. Without warning, a violent sound tore through the quiet hum of the server room. Not the dull thud of heavy gunfire. Not the hollow impact of bodies colliding with the cold metal siding of the barn. This was a high-pitched, agonizing screech of metal being ripped apart. I twisted in the chair, eyes snapping to the massive titanium bulkhead. A searing white pinpoint of light punched through the darkness of the outer barn, burning along the narrow seam where the heavy steel door met the concrete frame. The noise climbed rapidly, morphing into a furious, roaring hiss that shook the floorboards beneath my feet. Rufus pulled his tactical knife, stepping back from the door and planting himself behind a row of server racks. "They're not waiting for us to give ourselves up, William," he said, voice taut with adrenaline. "They brought a thermal lance." I stared in horror as a fountain of white-hot sparks erupted from the edge of the titanium hinge. The cartel enforcers were running a high-powered cutting torch magnesium rods, burning at over 4,000 degrees, melting their way straight through the steel vault. A thick gray cloud of smoke began to choke the space between the outer shell and our secondary door. That glowing point of light crept downward, carving a molten track through the reinforced plating. Rivulets of liquid steel ran down onto the concrete, washing the bunker in a trembling orange glow. We had gotten the evidence out, but the federal cavalry was still miles off. We were sealed inside a steel box, and the cartel was eating through our last line of defense. The heavy titanium hinges groaned as the lance chewed deeper into the locking mechanism. We had only minutes before the door gave way, and the full violent fury of the hit squad poured in on top of us. The molten metal dripped onto the concrete floor like liquid fire. The intense heat radiating from the breach was already pushing the temperature up inside our sealed underground fortress. Rufus moved with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a man who had spent his whole life readying himself for the worst possible moment. He reached deep into the tactical harness beneath his dark jacket and pulled out the hardware he'd methodically stripped from the two unconscious mercenaries we'd left bound in the mud outside. He pressed a heavy matte black semi-automatic pistol firmly into my open palm. The gun felt shockingly foreign and dangerously heavy in my shaking hand. I had spent my whole adult life putting up luxury real estate, not squaring off in a violent underground gunfight. Rufus didn't waste breath on empty reassurance. He simply checked the magazine of his own confiscated weapon, racked the slide to chamber a round with a sharp metallic clack, and nodded toward the dense humming rows of the data center. "We need cover that can soak up high-caliber rifle fire," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the bright burning ring slowly widening across the face of the titanium door. "Get behind the primary server arrays. The steel casings and dense copper wiring will stop a standard round. Don't shoot until they fully clear the threshold. As long as they have to funnel through that narrow smoking choke point, the tactical advantage stays ours." I gripped the pistol hard, my knuckles going white, and followed his lead. I pressed my back against the vibrating metal cabinet of the master server rack. The stench of burning magnesium and melting steel thickened, seeping in through the hairline gaps in the heavy door seals. The tension pressing down on that room was a physical weight. Every second stretched into what felt like an eternity of pure terror. Crouched behind the humming machines, my eyes swept across the polished stainless steel desk at the center of the room. Next to the glowing monitor, still showing the completed federal upload, I caught sight of a small brushed aluminum communication console, a thick red button on its face labeled for external broadcast. Lorraine had rigged the bunker with a sophisticated two-way audio system, wired directly to the outdoor PA speakers mounted on the barn exterior. She had built it so she could warn off trespassers without ever having to crack the reinforced door. A cold razor-sharp clarity cut through my mind. Dylan was out there in the frozen dark, sheltering behind a wall of cartel executioners, convinced that all the power in the world was sitting in his hands. He believed he was moments away from pocketing an $80 million fortune and wiping his father off the face of the earth. I had to shatter that smug delusion into dust before the door finally caved. I set the heavy pistol down on the concrete and crawled carefully toward the steel desk, keeping my body pressed as low as possible, staying well out of any line of sight from the melting door. I reached up and pushed my finger against the cold red button. R clears throat. The external microphones crackled awake, hauling in the howling wind and the furious hiss of the cutting torch from outside. "Dylan!" I said, my voice ringing out loud and clear across the deserted property through the high-powered exterior speakers. "I am not opening this door, and you are never going to see a single penny of your mother's money." Outside, the roar of the thermal lance abruptly stopped. A heavy, uneasy silence dropped over the property, broken only by the crackle of the intercom. I could hear Dylan screaming at his men to keep cutting, but the tremor running beneath his words gave him away. I pressed the red button again, pouring every drop of my cold, absolute fury into the microphone. "You are too late, Dylan," I said, my words slicing through the freezing night air with devastating calm. "I found Lorraine's hidden server. I found the forensic ledgers laying out your entire money laundering operation. I know exactly what you and Petra have been doing with the penthouse, and I know exactly who you've been doing it for. The cartel is not coming to rescue you tonight. They are going to slaughter you." The microphone caught a sharp, terrified gasp from Petra. I could picture every drop of color leaving her face. Dylan snatched up his megaphone, his voice completely unraveling. "You're lying, old man," he screamed, the metallic distortion unable to mask his mounting panic. "You don't know a damn thing. You're just a confused relic stalling for time. Open the vault before they burn you alive." I leaned in closer to the console, my heart beating out a steady, fearless rhythm. "I am not lying, Dylan," I answered, steady as stone. "And I am not stalling. I am simply keeping you occupied while the federal authorities get into position. 5 minutes ago, I triggered a dead man's switch your brilliant mother programmed into this server. Every page of your offshore banking records, every ghost shell company, and every illegal wire transfer has already been encrypted and delivered directly to the local field office of the Drug Enforcement Administration. The Cyber Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation is currently tearing through your entire financial network. The $12 million penthouse you killed your mother to claim is being seized by the federal government as we speak. You are completely wiped out, Dylan. You have nothing left to bring to your cartel bosses." The silence outside was total. The full shattering weight of his own destruction was finally settling into that treacherous mind of his. But I wasn't done. I wanted him to feel that same grinding, bottomless despair he had put his own mother through. "And Dylan," I went on, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried clearly through the outdoor speakers. "The federal authorities didn't just receive your financial records. They also received high-definition video footage from the hidden cameras your mother installed in her intensive care unit. They have crystal-clear footage of Petra injecting a lethal chemical agent into her IV line while you stood there and watched her take her last breath. You didn't outsmart anyone. Your mother recorded her own murder to make absolutely certain you would spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The cartel will know their domestic hub is gone before the sun comes up. You are a dead man walking, Dylan. Your only move now is to run." A sudden, furious, animalistic scream of pure, unchecked rage tore out of the megaphone outside. The thermal lance roared back to life. I crawled back toward Rufus, raising the heavy pistol. A massive boom shook the foundation as the locking mechanism finally gave. The door was breached. Smoke swallowed the room. Cartel enforcers poured through the gap, laser sights slashing through the darkness. The smoke rolling off the melted titanium hinges was thick and acrid, needling my eyes. Through the churning gray haze, a dozen crimson laser sights punched through the dark skittering, wildly across the polished concrete floor and the black steel faces of the server racks. Rufus knelt completely still beside me, his stolen weapon raised and locked onto the breech. His breathing was slow, and even the terrifying composure of a man who had made his peace with what was coming. I held the heavy pistol in both hands, my finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. We were badly outnumbered and hopelessly outgunned. The deafening blast of their automatic rifles felt like a certainty closing in on us. I pressed my shoulders against the vibrating server cabinet, entirely prepared to defend Lorraine's legacy with my last breath. But the killing volley never came. Before a single shot could ring out inside that underground bunker, everything around us suddenly changed. A deep rhythmic thumping began pounding through the reinforced concrete ceiling above, swelling louder with every fraction of a second. The unmistakable roar of multiple heavy helicopter rotors bearing down hard on the desolate farm. Brilliant white beams of light ripped through the gaps in the splintered wooden barn roof high overhead. Massive aerial spotlights swept hard across the property, drowning the dark, overgrown land in a glaring, artificial daylight. That sudden assault from the sky sent a massive shockwave of confusion directly through the ranks of the hit squad. The crimson laser sights stopped dancing across our cover and jerked upward toward the ceiling as the thundering noise swallowed everything. Through the crackling exterior microphones of the bunker's communication console, a booming, electronically amplified voice split the freezing night air. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are completely surrounded. Drop your weapons immediately." The command came twice more overlapping, with the screaming sirens of dozens of armored federal transport vehicles smashing through the ruined front gates. I risked a quick look over the edge of the steel desk at the bank of high-definition security monitors. The tactical feeds showed a scene of total, overwhelming chaos. The 4 matte black cartel vehicles that had been blocking the barn entrance with such arrogance were now completely boxed in by a massive coordinated swarm of federal agents. heavily armed SWAT teams from the Bureau and specialized tactical units from the Drug Enforcement Administration spilled out of their transports in perfect synchronization. They rolled forward like a tide of dark blue armor, locking down the perimeter behind raised ballistic shields and overwhelming firepower. Inside the bunker, the psychological effect of the raid hit instantly and completely. The cartel enforcers understood in a heartbeat that their domestic operation had been catastrophically blown. They knew that trading fire with federal tactical teams meant immediate certain death. The lead enforcer let his heavy weapon drop to the concrete with a loud clatter and put his empty hands in the air. The rest of the breach team followed without hesitation. The suffocating threat of slaughter evaporated, replaced by the chaotic noise of tactical surrender. Rufus lowered his pistol slowly and gave me a firm, relieved nod. The cavalry had arrived. I turned back to the glowing security monitors, desperate to find the two people who had set this entire nightmare in motion. The exterior cameras gave a clean, unobstructed view of the muddy clearing outside the barn. The cartel guards who had been holding the perimeter were already on their knees while federal agents moved swiftly to lock them down with heavy plastic restraints. But Dylan and Petra were not among the kneeling mercenaries. I swept through the adjacent camera feeds quickly and spotted them near the edge of the overgrown tree line. Every trace of the polished, arrogant facade of the Houston investment bankers was gone. They looked like terrified, hunted animals. As the federal tactical unit swarmed across the property and dismantled their cartel protection piece by piece, Dylan and Petra grasped that their grand murderous scheme had caved in completely. Driven by nothing but naked cowardice, they abandoned their armed escorts and broke into a desperate, frantic run toward the dense, freezing woods at the back of the lot. I watched my son flee his expensive tactical jacket, whipping wildly in the rotor wash. Petra ran slightly behind him, struggling to keep her footing on the rough, uneven ground. The helicopter spotlights tracked their pathetic retreat without effort, keeping them pinned in the center of a blazing circle of light in the muddy field. Dylan threw a look back over his shoulder, his face a pale mask of pure terror, and in that moment he must have understood the entire perimeter was sealed. In his frantic, headlong scramble to outrun the consequences bearing down on him, he stopped watching where he was going. His expensive polished boots skidded out from under him on a thick patch of wet, freezing mud. He pitched forward with brutal force, driving his face straight into the filthy, freezing sludge. The fall was violent and utterly without dignity. He clawed at the mud in desperation, his dark jacket soaked through and ruined, unable to get any grip on the slick ground. Petra didn't so much as slow down to look at him. She kept sprinting for the trees, leaving him to whatever came next, only to be cut off hard by 3 heavily armored federal agents who drove her down into the dead grass. Dylan pushed himself up to his knees, his face plastered with dark, freezing mud. He was weeping openly now, the raw, unguarded sobbing of a man who understood it was finished. He twisted desperately toward a pair of cartel enforcers who were being forced to the ground at gunpoint by the advancing SWAT team. "Please!" Dylan begged, his voice cracking apart. "Please, you have to help me up. We can still work something out. I can still get the money." The cartel enforcer, a hardened man now staring down decades in federal prison because of Dylan's catastrophic incompetence, turned his head slowly. He looked down at the weeping, mud-caked investment banker with an expression of pure, undisguised contempt. He knew they had been set up, and he knew without question who had brought the whole operation down. He did not reach out a hand. Instead, the enforcer leaned forward and spat directly into Dylan's tear-streaked face. Before my son could even process the full, humiliating rejection of the criminals he had cast his lot with, the federal tactical units came down on him with total, unforgiving force. 4 heavily armored agents hit him at once. They drove him violently back into the freezing mud, pressing heavy knees into his spine. His desperate, pathetic sobbing was instantly smothered as his face was ground back into the dirt. They wrenched his arms behind his back with brutal efficiency, the sharp metallic snap of steel handcuffs ringing clearly through the exterior microphones. As I stared at the high-definition monitor and watched the federal agents haul my sobbing, humiliated son up out of the mud, the frozen rage that had been locked in my chest finally began to loosen, leaving behind a cold, unshakable sense of permanent justice. The heavy steel bulkhead of the bunker was secured by a team of armed federal agents. As Rufus and I finally climbed out of that subterranean fortress, the acrid bite of melted titanium from the thermal lance still hung in the air. though the cool, crisp wind sweeping across the open land quickly carried it away. The suffocating pressure that had been clamped around my chest for the past hour began to lift, replaced by the chaotic sounds of absolute justice playing out across my property. I stepped out of the barn and walked into something that looked like a war zone. The entire farm blazed under the strobing pulse of red and blue police lights. Dozens of federal tactical vehicles formed a steel wall around the perimeter, their engines idling with a low, menacing growl. Helicopters kept circling overhead, their heavy rotors beating the freezing air as their powerful spotlights raked the dark tree line, making sure no one slipped through the net. The cartel enforcers who had arrived minutes earlier to slaughter me were now lined up against the sides of their matte, black SUVs, body armor, stripped weapons, taken wrists bound tight with thick plastic restraints. They looked utterly broken faces pressed against the cold metal doors by the federal tactical units. I didn't spare them another glance. My eyes were hunting for the two people who had engineered this nightmare. I found them on their knees in the center of the muddy clearing, hemmed in by a tight ring of federal agents. The gap between the polished, arrogant Houston investment bankers I had known and the wretched, broken criminals kneeling in the filth was staggering. Petra was shaking in the freezing night air. Her expensive clothing was ripped and soaked with mud. Her hair was plastered against the side of her face, and her wrists were locked in steel handcuffs behind her back. She stared emptily at the ground, completely paralyzed by the sudden and total collapse of her world. Dylan was in even worse shape. The son I had raised with every advantage, the boy who had attended the finest private schools and lived a life of privilege, was now a sobbing, hyperventilating wreck. His face was coated in freezing mud and the spit of the cartel enforcer he'd so foolishly placed his trust in. He was weeping without restraint, his chest convulsing with ragged sobs, while two agents held him firmly by the shoulders. He looked small, fragile, and completely stripped of the arrogance he had worn, like a crown, his entire adult life. I crossed the ruined grass toward them, mud squelching under the soles of my work boots. Rufus moved silently alongside me, a watchful shadow at my back. The federal agent stepped aside, opening a path directly to the two prisoners. As my shadow fell over him, Dylan raised his head. His bloodshot, tear-filled eyes found mine. And for one brief moment, I caught a glimpse of the little boy I used to carry on my shoulders. But that boy was gone, buried under years of greed, betrayal, and blood. Dylan strained against the agents holding him, trying to drag himself closer to my boots. "Dad," he forced the word out in a broken whisper, barely audible above the helicopter engines. "Dad, please tell them it's a mistake. I'm your son. You have to tell them this is a misunderstanding. You have to save me." The sheer audacity of that plea hit me like a fist. After plotting my murder, after unleashing an armed siege against my life, after trading his own mother for a slice of leveraged real estate, his first instinct was to beg me to pull him out of the fire. I stood there looking down at his weeping face with cold detachment. The grief that had once hollowed me out was gone, replaced by an absolute unsparing clarity. I did not see my child kneeling in the dirt. I saw the monster who had torn my family apart for personal gain. "You have no idea what is actually happening right now. Do you, Dylan?" I said, my voice cutting clean through the noise of the raid. "You still think you can talk your way clear of this? You still believe your money and that charming smile of yours can wash the blood off your hands?" Dylan sobbed harder, shaking his head. "Please, Dad, I didn't want any of this. I was buried in debt. They pushed me into it. The cartel was going to kill Petra and me if we didn't deliver the money. We were trapped. I had to secure the estate. I had no other choice." A low, bitter sound came out of me, nothing remotely close to laughter. "There is always a choice, Dylan." I said, the words hanging in the freezing air. "You could have come to me. You could have told me the truth about your failures and what you owed those people. I would have spent every cent I had to shield you from them. I would have bankrupted myself completely to keep you alive. But you didn't come to me for help. You chose to run dirty money through my name. You chose to turn the luxury penthouse I built into the beating heart of a violent criminal enterprise. You chose to send an armed tactical unit to this farm tonight to slip a heavy sedative into my hand so I would quietly die in my sleep. This wasn't a simple mistake, Dylan. You actively, deliberately conspired to erase me from this earth so you could raid your mother's hidden vault and settle your bloody debts." Petra finally looked up, her face pale and twisted with sudden desperate panic. "Gerald, please be reasonable." she pleaded, her voice shaking hard. We can surrender the penthouse. We can cooperate fully with the federal investigators and hand over the cartel leadership. We can fix this. You have to tell them we are victims in all of this. I turned my eyes to Petra and felt nothing but pure, unfiltered disgust. You are not victims, I said flatly, loud enough for every federal agent standing nearby to hear. You are cold, calculating murderers, and you are both going to spend the rest of your miserable lives rotting in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Dylan wrenched weakly against the agents, pinning him down. Dad, no, please! He wailed, his voice coming apart entirely. I am your one and only son. You can't let them take me. You're my father. You have to protect me. You have to forgive me. I took one final step forward, standing directly over him. I looked down into his terrified, weeping eyes and let the full, crushing weight of my absolute rejection obliterate whatever last shred of hope he was clinging to. You stopped being my son the exact moment you put that poison into your mother's arm. The silence that followed was heavy, total, and final. Dylan stared up at me, unable to take in the full scope of what he had lost. But Petra understood. The calculating mask she had worn for years cracked apart completely. She wrenched her body violently away from her husband. It was him! Petra screamed over the hammering helicopter blades. It was entirely his idea. He forced me into it. He told me the cartel would wipe out my entire family if I didn't help him secure the estate. I had absolutely no choice. I am the victim here. Dylan's head snapped toward her, his mud-streaked face twisting into a look of pure, disbelieving shock. His own wife was throwing him to the wolves to save herself. They erupted at each other, hurling vicious accusations back and forth in a wretched display of cowardice. A deep wave of nausea moved through me. These two people who had schemed to build an empire were disintegrating the instant they faced a real consequence. A tall man, wearing a jacket emblazoned with the letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, stepped forward. He moved with calm, unhurried authority. He walked straight past the screaming couple and came directly to where Rufus and I stood. He pulled off his tactical glove and extended a firm hand. Mr. Crane, the lead agent said, his voice a deep, steady baritone that demanded attention. My name is Special Agent Steed. I want you to know that you are completely safe now. We received the full data package from your automated server protocol exactly 22 minutes ago. Your wife's forensic accounting ledgers are flawless. They gave us the exact decryption keys we needed to fully dismantle their illicit financial network. I took his hand, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the past month finally begin to ease off my weary shoulders. Agent Steed turned his attention down to Dylan, who had gone quiet and was now staring up at the federal agent with wide, terrified eyes. Dylan. Agent Steed said, his tone stripped of any warmth or sympathy. I am formally advising you that, as of 10 minutes ago, a federal judge approved an emergency seizure order under the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Your luxury penthouse in downtown Houston has been raided and officially seized by the United States government. Every domestic and offshore bank account tied to your name, your dummy shell companies, and your wife has been completely frozen and seized. You don't have a single dime left to your name. You are completely bankrupt. Dylan let out a hollow, agonizing gasp, his head dropping forward onto his chest as the final nail was driven home. The vast stolen fortune he had sold his soul to secure had dissolved into nothing. There is one more thing, Agent Steed, I said, reaching a steady hand into the deep pocket of my heavy jacket. I pulled out the small, innocent-looking plastic bottle of capsules that Petra had pressed so urgently into my palm earlier that afternoon. I held it out in front of the federal agent. My daughter-in-law gave these to me just a few hours ago, I said, making sure my voice carried clearly over the idling engines of the armored transports. She told me they were high-grade nutritional supplements to help me sleep and manage my grief. I strongly suspect your forensic laboratory will find that they contain a lethal, untraceable chemical agent. Their plan was for me to drive out to this remote property, take this poison, and quietly die of a massive, completely undetectable heart attack. Petra let out a horrific strangled wail, her eyes rolling back slightly as the full depth of her legal exposure hit her all at once. The federal agent took the bottle from my hand and slipped it carefully into a clear, tamper-proof evidence bag. He looked down at the sobbing woman with an expression of pure, icy contempt. Well, Petra, Agent Steed said, sealing the evidence bag, It appears we will be adding the attempted premeditated murder of a federal witness to your growing list of charges right alongside the first-degree murder of your mother-in-law and federal racketeering. You are both looking at multiple consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of parole. The lead agent gestured sharply to his tactical team. 4 heavily armored officers stepped forward, grabbed Dylan and Petra by their upper arms, and hauled them up out of the freezing mud. They were not handled like wealthy, sophisticated investment bankers. They were handled like the violent, treacherous criminals they had always been. I stood silently, my breathing finally slow and steady, watching my son and his wife get dragged across the ruined grass. They were shoved roughly into the back of a heavily armored federal police cruiser. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deafening final thud, sealing them inside a dark cage entirely of their own making. The convoy of federal vehicles began rolling away tires, churning up thick waves of mud and gravel as they worked their way down the long, dark driveway. The blinding spotlights of the helicopters swung away, banking hard to the east as they escorted the convoy back toward the city. The roaring symphony of sirens and shouted commands faded gradually into the distance, leaving a profound, heavy quiet over the desolate valley. The flashing red and blue lights vanished beyond the horizon, dropping the property back into the calm darkness of the rural night. I stood alone in the center of the muddy clearing, the cold wind moving gently against my face. The overwhelming terror and adrenaline that had driven my every action for the past several hours were slowly draining away, leaving a strange, hollow tranquility behind. Justice had finally been served. Lorraine's killers were locked away, and her legacy was safe. Rufus stepped quietly out of the shadows near the splintered wooden gates, his heavy tactical boots crunching softly on the gravel. He walked over and stood beside me, scanning the empty driveway before letting his eyes settle on the rusting farmhouse. Then he reached out and placed a heavy, steadying hand firmly on my shoulder. That silent gesture said everything: a deep bond forged in the fire of unimaginable violence and shared survival. We had held the line when it seemed impossible. "What now, Jerry?" Rufus asked, his gravelly voice remarkably calm, and even in the silence that followed the raid. I turned my head and looked slowly across the withered grass. I took in the rotting wooden planks of the main house, the caved-in roof, the thorough and deliberate state of disrepair that masked the true nature of what lay beneath. I thought about the impenetrable high-tech fortress, buried deep under the mud, and the $80 million empire of bearer bonds and mineral rights sitting quietly in the dark. I drew a long breath of the cold night air. Now I build. Exactly 6 months have passed since that terrifying, freezing night in the hidden underground bunker. The heavy, suffocating darkness that once defined this desolate stretch of East Texas earth has been entirely wiped away. The federal justice system moved with uncharacteristic, merciless speed, powered by the flawless mountain of encrypted digital evidence my beautiful wife had so meticulously compiled. The massive data payload Lorraine had engineered to detonate from beyond the grave hit the international cartel with the devastating, unstoppable force of a targeted strike. Within 48 hours of the farm raid, the federal authorities had completely dismantled the entire money laundering network. High-ranking cartel lieutenants, corrupt banking officials, and ruthless enforcers were simultaneously dragged from their comfortable beds in the dead of night, locked in heavy steel chains, and buried under an avalanche of federal racketeering charges. Dylan and Petra did not escape the crushing weight of their own terrifying arrogance. Their high-priced defense attorneys abandoned them the instant the government seized every last penny of their ill-gotten, blood-soaked wealth. They stood in the packed federal courtroom, entirely alone, stripped of their tailored designer clothes and their polished, deceitful smiles. I sat in the front row of the gallery on the day of their final sentencing. I watched in absolute silence as the stern federal judge handed down their punishments for the brutal, premeditated first-degree murder of my beloved wife, and for their extensive, undeniable roles in a massive international criminal syndicate. Dylan and Petra were each sentenced to consecutive life terms in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Parole was denied. They will never breathe free air again. They will die inside those small concrete cages. With my treacherous son permanently removed from society, I turned my full attention to the immense fortune Lorraine had left behind. $80 million in untraceable bearer bonds and lucrative mineral rights waited quietly in the dark, ready for a righteous purpose. I had no interest in simply sitting on the wealth. I wanted to forge it into a powerful, lasting weapon against the same brand of cruelty that had nearly destroyed my life. I brought in the finest demolition crews in the state to completely level the rotting farmhouse and the rusted corrugated metal barn. We tore up the frozen blood-stained mud and excavated the hidden concrete bunker, scrubbing the grim history of the property from the earth entirely. In its place, I built something magnificent, a sprawling sanctuary. The new facility rises proudly against the backdrop of the rugged East Texas piney woods, built from warm, natural stone, and broad expanses of reinforced glass that funnel the healing Southeast Texas sunlight into every corridor. This is not a hidden vault. It is a state-of-the-art legal advocacy center and a permanent, highly secure residential sanctuary built exclusively for vulnerable senior citizens who have been financially exploited, physically abused, or maliciously manipulated by their own families. We employ a dedicated team of former federal prosecutors, sharp forensic accountants, and compassionate trauma therapists. We provide absolute impenetrable shelter and aggressive legal representation to those who have been discarded by the very people who were supposed to love and protect them most. Rufus stayed at my side through the entire construction process. The battle-hardened former Marine traded his tactical gear for tailored civilian suits, taking on the role of primary director of security for the entire compound. He oversees a highly trained staff committed to ensuring that no predator, no abusive relative, and no desperate criminal will ever breach these walls. Our residents walk the grounds with complete peace of mind, knowing they are protected by a shield built from absolute resolve and formidable resources. The wealth that Dylan and Petra had so desperately tried to steal to save their own pathetic lives is now being put to work, dismantling the lives of other abusers. I walk slowly along the winding, beautifully paved paths of the central courtyard. The air is warm and fragrant, carrying the sweet, comforting scent of blooming honeysuckle and wild magnolia. I am 70 years old, and yet I feel remarkably, undeniably reborn. That bone-deep, suffocating grief, the kind that once threatened to pull me under entirely, has given way to something steadier and more lasting purpose. I let my feet stop and stand quietly before a massive ancient pecan tree positioned at the very heart of the sanctuary gardens. Tucked among its thick, gnarled roots sits a simple bronze plaque polished to a warm sheen. My name is nowhere on it. The bloody chaos of the cartel raid goes unrecorded. What it holds is a single inscription, words for the brilliant, fearless woman who saw the darkness gathering and spent her final strength forging the weapon that would outlast her. In loving memory of Lorraine, her light remains our shield. I reach out and trace the raised lettering slowly with my fingertips. The afternoon sun has warmed the metal until it almost feels alive. Lorraine waged one war flat on her back in a hospital bed. Then she rose from the grave and fought a second, and that one she won decisively. Every treacherous move Dylan made she had already mapped and countered. He answered his greed. She answered it with love, and love hit harder. He looked at me and saw a man too old to threaten him. He looked at his mother and saw a woman too ill to fight. Catastrophically, fatally wrong on both counts. Her devotion had already wrapped an impenetrable shield around my life, and her sharp, relentless mind had already set the perfect trap. I draw a long breath in the golden afternoon light. The nightmare is over, finally, completely, and without any way back. I scan the peaceful horizon and know deep in my bones that our family's fortune is at last fulfilling the purpose it was always meant to serve. The dark secrets that corroded our lives have been scoured away by an unrelenting pursuit of truth. Every day people arrive here broken and leave, carrying something real. The empire of shadows is gone. In its place stands a legacy of light, justice, and protection that will not waver. Greed is a venom it destroys without exception. But the sharpest betrayal never comes from a stranger. It comes from someone you shaped, someone you sacrificed for. We build our lives into something worth inheriting, hoping our children absorb our character, but some only take the wealth. Blood is no promise of loyalty, and years lived are no measure of how easily a man can be broken. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, I want to say thank you. Genuinely, this one was not easy to carry. Looking back, what strikes me most is not the betrayal itself, though that wound runs deep, but the love that quietly outlasted it. Lorraine knew what was coming. She spent her final painful years not in bitterness, but in careful, deliberate protection. That cost her something I can never fully measure. What it taught me is that the people who love us most sometimes work in silence, building shields we don't even know we need. I believe God placed that knowledge in her heart long before I had the eyes to see what was in front of me. Here is what I would want you to carry away from all of this. Do not confuse a signature on a document with proof of loyalty. Watch what people do when they think you are no longer useful to them. If someone rushes you to sign, to hand over, or to step aside, slow down. Urgency is often a weapon. An inheritance is not just money. Guard the values behind what you built as fiercely as the assets themselves. And never mistake age for vulnerability. Some of the most formidable people I have ever known fought their greatest battles late in life. If this story stirred something in you, I'd be grateful if you left a comment below and told me what hit you hardest. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, a parent, a friend, anyone navigating a family they can no longer fully trust, please pass it along to them. Subscribe to His Hidden Revenge so you don't miss what comes next. These stories matter, and so do the people who listen to them. Thank you for being one of them. Take good care of yourself.